You don't survive in the antique appraisal business for 20 years by believing in ghost stories. You survive by understanding the cold, hard facts of history, the undeniable authenticity of aged wood, and the precise value of a dead stranger's forgotten memories. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the better part of 2 decades, I have made a comfortable living navigating the dusty attics and abandoned estates of New England. I buy the things people leave behind, restore them, and sell them to collectors who crave a piece of the past. I've handled everything from blood-stained Civil War surgical kits to Victorian mourning jewelry made of human hair. Nothing ever bothered me. I always believed that objects were just objects: wood, glass, fabric, and metal. They had no memory. They had no soul. I was wrong. God help me, I was so completely wrong. It started in late October, during one of those relentless, bone-chilling rainstorms that seemed to wash the color right out of the world. I received a call from an estate liquidator about a property in rural Connecticut, just outside a town so small it barely registered on the map. The estate belonged to the Blackwood family, a bloodline that had essentially died out, leaving behind a sprawling, decaying Victorian mansion that had been sealed off from the world since the late 1970s. The liquidator sounded desperate. He said the bank wanted the house cleared by the end of the month, and he was willing to let me have first pick of the attic for a fraction of the usual cost. The only catch was that I had to go there immediately. The drive was miserable. The rain lashed against my windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. By the time I pulled my truck up the overgrown gravel driveway, the sky was the color of bruised iron. The Blackwood house loomed at the end of the path like a rotting tooth against the gray horizon. It was a massive 3-story structure of dark wood and shattered windows, suffocated by decades of unchecked ivy. The liquidator, a nervous, sweaty man named Miller, was waiting for me on the wraparound porch. He didn't even want to go inside with me. "The attic is on the 3rd floor, at the end of the hall," Miller said, handing me a heavy brass key that felt unnaturally cold in my palm. He kept glancing over his shoulder at the heavy oak front door, as if he expected it to fly open on its own. "Take whatever you want. Just leave the money in the drop box at my office. I have another appointment. I can't stay." Before I could even ask a question, Miller was walking briskly towards his sedan. He peeled out of the driveway, his tires kicking up mud, leaving me entirely alone with the house. I shook my head, amused by his paranoia. Amateurs always let the atmosphere of these old places get to their heads. I unlocked the heavy front door and pushed it open. The hinges screamed in protest, a sharp, metallic shriek that echoed endlessly through the empty halls. The smell hit me immediately, a suffocating mixture of mildew, decaying velvet, and something else. Something distinctively metallic, like old copper coins or dried blood. I clicked on my heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick, swirling dust motes. The house was a time capsule of forgotten luxury. Sheets covered the furniture like ghosts, and the wallpaper was peeling away in long, curled strips, revealing the dark plaster underneath. I bypassed the main living areas and headed straight for the grand staircase. The wooden steps groaned under my weight, each creak sounding uncomfortably loud in the oppressive silence of the house. When I finally reached the 3rd-floor attic, the air grew noticeably colder. My breath plumed in white clouds before the beam of my flashlight. The attic was massive, stretching the entire length of the house, piled high with steamer trunks, broken rocking chairs, and boxes of moth-eaten clothes. I began my routine, sifting through the debris with an expert eye. I found a few items of decent value: a silver-backed hand mirror, a collection of first-edition Edgar Allan Poe hardcovers, and a beautiful, albeit tarnished, pocket watch. But then, tucked away in the deepest, darkest corner of the attic, sitting beneath a moldy tarp, I saw the display case. It was a tall, rectangular cabinet made of rich, dark mahogany. featuring glass panels on all four sides. It was incredibly well crafted, easily dating back to the late 1800s. I pulled the tarp away, the fabric tearing easily in my hands, and pointed my flashlight inside. My breath caught in my throat. Sitting in the center of the case, perfectly preserved upon a tiny velvet-cushioned chair, was a doll. But calling it a doll feels entirely inadequate. It was a Victorian mourning doll, often called a grave doll or an effigy. In the 19th century, when a child died, heartbroken parents would sometimes have a life-sized wax or porcelain replica made to place by the gravesite or keep in the home. This one was about 3 feet tall, the size of a toddler. It was dressed in a faded black silk mourning dress, adorned with intricate hand-stitched lace that had yellowed with time. The hands and face were crafted from bisque porcelain, painted with a terrifying, hyper-realistic attention to detail. The lips were a pale, bruised purple, and the cheeks lacked any rosy tint, mimicking the pallor of death perfectly. But it was the hair and the eyes that made my stomach churn. The dark, cascading curls framing its porcelain face weren't synthetic. As an appraiser, I knew the texture instantly. It was real human hair. Most likely, it had been cut from the head of the deceased child it was modeled after. And the eyes, they were made of blown glass, a pale, milky blue. They caught the beam of my flashlight and seemed to hold the light, gleaming with a wet, lifelike intensity. They didn't stare blankly into space like a normal toy. They seemed to be focusing, looking right at me. Despite the deep, primal sense of unease pooling in my gut, the logical part of my brain took over. This was a museum-quality piece. A pristine, flawlessly preserved Victorian mourning doll in its original custom case could fetch upwards of $10,000 from the right collector. I couldn't leave it here. I examined the case. It was locked with a small iron padlock. I checked the base of the cabinet and noticed a small folded piece of parchment wedged beneath the velvet lining. Carefully, I pulled it out. It was a clipping from a local newspaper, dated November 14th, 1892. The paper was fragile, crumbling at the edges. The headline read, "Tragedy at the Blackwood estate. Young Abigail found deceased in locked chamber. Authorities baffled." I skimmed the article. It detailed a horrific, unsolved mystery. 7-year-old Abigail Blackwood had been found dead in her bedroom. The door had been locked from the inside. The windows were bolted shut. There was no weapon, no sign of forced entry, and no medical explanation for her sudden demise. The police had ruled it a tragic sudden illness, but the article hinted at dark rumors among the townspeople. The final sentence of the clipping sent a sudden, freezing chill down my spine. Upon discovering the poor child's body, the maid reported that Abigail's prized porcelain effigy, an item she was never permitted to play with, was found sitting upright upon the victim's chest. I swallowed hard, forcing a nervous chuckle. "Just a bit of morbid history to increase the provenance," I muttered to myself, my voice sounding weak in the massive, empty attic. I loaded the heavy display case into the back of my truck, carefully securing it with bungee cords. By the time I finished, the rain had turned into a torrential downpour, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the Blackwood estate. I got into the driver's seat, blasted the heater to fight off the damp chill, and started the engine. The drive home took over 3 hours. The storm was worsening, the visibility reduced to mere feet in front of my headlights. The entire way, I couldn't shake a profound feeling of paranoia. Every few minutes, my eyes would dart to the rearview mirror. Through the rain-streaked rear window of the cab, I could see the silhouette of the display case in the truck bed. Whenever the lightning flashed, illuminating the darkness for a split second, I swore I could see the pale, milky blue eyes of the doll staring through the wet glass, looking at the back of my head. "It's just your imagination, Elias," I kept telling myself. "It's an antique. It's made of mud, heat, and old hair." I arrived at my home, a modest house with a large, detached garage that served as my restoration workshop. I carefully unloaded the display case and wheeled it into the center of the workshop on a hand truck. I didn't want to bring it inside the house. I couldn't explain why, but the idea of sleeping with that thing under the same roof made my skin crawl. My golden retriever, Barnaby, usually greeted me at the workshop door, tail wagging, eager for a treat. Tonight, he stood at the edge of the driveway, the rain soaking his golden fur. He was staring past me, directly at the heavy wooden doors of the workshop. His tail was tucked firmly between his legs, the fur along his spine standing straight up. He let out a low, continuous rumbling growl that I had never heard him make in his entire life. "It's okay, boy. It's just old furniture," I coaxed, patting my leg. Barnaby didn't move. He took one step backward, bared his teeth at the workshop, and then turned and bolted toward the main house, whimpering. I stood alone in the rain for a moment, an icy dread wrapping around my heart. I shook it off, attributing the dog's behavior to the thunder. I walked into the workshop, turned on the bright fluorescent overhead lights, and locked the heavy deadbolt behind me. I approached the case. I needed to clean the exterior wood and assess the doll closer before putting it up for auction. I grabbed a set of lockpicks from my workbench and made short work of the ancient iron padlock. It popped open with a heavy click. I pulled the glass door open. The metallic, coppery smell I had noticed at the Blackwood estate wafted out, much stronger now. It smelled distinctly like an old, unventilated hospital room. I reached in and carefully lifted the doll. It was surprisingly heavy, the porcelain thick and dense. The joints were articulated, allowing it to be posed. As I carried it to my main workbench, its head lolled to the side, and the glass eyes caught the harsh fluorescent light. I set it down gently, propping it up against a stack of wooden crates so it was facing the back wall of the shop. I didn't want it looking at me while I worked. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously polishing the mahogany case, repairing a minor crack in the base, and cataloging its dimensions. It was grueling, tedious work, but the rhythmic motion calmed my nerves. The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling against the aluminum siding of the garage. It was approaching 2 a.m. when I finally decided to call it a night. I was exhausted, my muscles aching from the long day. I gathered my cleaning supplies, turned off the air compressor, and wiped the sweat from my forehead. I turned around to grab the doll and put it back into its case. My heart completely stopped. The air vanished from my lungs. The rag dropped from my numb fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a soft thud. I had placed the doll on the workbench, leaning against the crates, facing the back wall. I remembered doing it. I was absolutely certain of it. But the doll was no longer facing the wall. It was sitting perfectly upright on the edge of the table. Its head was turned sharply to the left. The pale purple lips were slightly parted, though I could have sworn the mouth was completely closed before. And its milky glass eyes were locked directly on the deadbolt of the workshop door. I stood paralyzed, the logical foundation of my entire world fracturing in a single terrifying instant. I told myself it was vibrations from the storm. I told myself it was the unstable joints settling under their own weight. But as a massive clap of thunder shook the foundation of the garage, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered, died, and plunged me into absolute, suffocating darkness. And in that pitch-black silence, over the sound of the rain, I heard the undeniable, sickening sound of porcelain joints squeaking, followed by a soft, wet footstep on the concrete floor behind me. The sound of that wet, heavy footstep hitting the concrete floor froze the blood in my veins. It was a sound that didn't belong in a locked workshop at 2 a.m. It wasn't the scuttle of a rat or the settling of the building. It had weight, it had purpose, and it was right behind me. I stood paralyzed, the fumbling rag having slipped from my numb fingers. My breath came in short, ragged gasps that seemed to echo inside my own skull. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to confront whatever was in the dark, but my muscles refused to obey. The darkness was absolute, a thick, suffocating curtain that felt heavier than the rain outside. Then I felt it. A draft. Not a cold breeze from the storm, but a focused, freezing pocket of air hovering just behind my right shoulder. With it, The cupbery smell of old blood and hospital disinfectant intensified, so potent now it coated the back of my throat. I swallowed, a dry, clicking sound in the silence. "It's not real," I chanted, a frantic mantra. "You're exhausted. You fell asleep for a second. This is a nightmare." With a sudden, violent surge of willpower, I fumbled in my pocket for my smartphone. My fingers were shaking so uncontrollably I almost dropped it. I managed to press the side button, and the lock screen illuminated the area around my hands with a weak blue light. I turned, slow, agonizingly slow, expecting to see Abigail Blackwood's dead, pale face, inches from mine. But the space directly behind me was empty. Just the concrete floor and stacks of restoration tools gleaming dully in the phone's glow. My flashlight. It was still on the main workbench, near where I had left the doll. I had to get to it. I shuffled backward, my phone's light sweeping the floor. Step by painful step, I moved, the sound of my own heart like a war drum in my ears. I reached the workbench. I didn't look up immediately. I couldn't. I fumbled along the wooden surface until my hand brushed against the heavy metal of the flashlight. I grabbed it, clicking the switch to the on position. The beam cut through the darkness with punishing intensity. I aimed it at the end of the bench where I had propped the doll against the crates. It wasn't there. The beam swept wildly across the workshop. No. This was impossible. The door was locked. I was alone. Then, the flashlight beam caught something on the floor, about 10 feet away, near the heavy mahogany case. My heart completely stopped. Again, the Victorian mourning doll was lying on its back on the cold concrete. One of its bisque porcelain arms was flung out to the side, its fingers curled inward. The black silk dress was spread out around it like a dark pool. Its head, however, was not resting on the concrete. It was lulled sharply to the side, propped up against the base of the cabinet, forcing its gaze back toward the main workbench. Back toward me. In the harsh, unforgiving beam of my flashlight, the milky glass blue eyes seemed brighter, more focused. The violet parted lips looked less like a manufacturing detail and more like they were caught in the act of forming a silent word. "Okay," I whispered, my voice cracked and completely devoid of its usual authority. "Okay, fine." The crate settled. It fell. It rolled. Concrete is uneven. That's physics. That's just physics. I didn't believe a word of it. I had been an appraiser for 20 years. I knew how these joints worked. I knew the weight distribution. They didn't fall without making a sound that would rattle the roof, and they certainly didn't roll 10 feet across a flat floor and prop their own heads up. I knew, deep in a part of my mind I had ignored for decades, that I was lying to myself. But admitting the alternative was worse. Admitting the alternative meant I was trapped in a room with a 7-year-old's ghost that had hitched a ride inside a porcelain nightmare. I needed to put it back. I needed to lock it away, chain the cabinet, and call a priest, or a psychiatrist, or anyone who didn't deal in wood and varnish. I forced myself to walk forward. Every step was a battle against my own biology. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick molasses. The air around the doll was practically freezing now, causing the skin on my arms to break out in intense goosebumps. I reached the doll. I stood over it, my flashlight pointed directly at its face. I looked at the dark human hair cascading around its pale forehead. I remembered the newspaper article. Clarissa, Abigail's mother, singing to this very doll, brushing this very hair. I reached down and grabbed the doll by its torso. It felt impossibly heavy now, much heavier than when I had unloaded it. Its porcelain skin was colder than the concrete floor. As I lifted it, its arms and legs lulled with a sickening, heavy thud. I carried it to the mahogany case, my gaze locked on the doll's face, terrified that it might move, might reach out and grab my arm. It didn't. It remained motionless, just dead bisque and faded silk. I placed it gently back onto the little velvet cushioned chair in the center of the case. I positioned it exactly as I had found it, arms resting in its lap, head facing forward. Just an object, I told myself. A very, very unsettling object. I swung the heavy glass door shut. It closed with a heavy, satisfying thwack. I grabbed the set of heavy steel security chains I usually used for transport and wrapped them around the entire case, winding them through the intricate brass handles. I secured the chains with 2 industrial-grade master locks. The sound of the final padlock clicking shut felt like a small victory. "You stay there," I said, my voice gathering a shred of defensive anger. "You stay right there, Abigail." I grabbed my flashlight and my keys. I didn't bother turning on the main lights. I wanted out. Now. I didn't clean up the rag or the spilled tools. I backed toward the heavy deadbolt, my flashlight beam still fixed on the chained mahogany case. I unlocked the deadbolt and slipped outside, slamming the workshop door shut behind me. I locked it from the exterior and stood for a moment in the pouring rain, letting the cold water wash over my sweaty face. I leaned my forehead against the rough aluminum siding of the garage and just breathed. My dog, Barnaby, usually slept at the foot of my bed. Tonight, when I finally staggered into my bedroom, I found him huddled in the furthest corner of the living room, curled tight against the baseboard. His eyes were wide and filled with anxiety, and he was making a strange, low whining sound that never completely stopped. I slept with the lights on that night, or rather, I lay awake with the lights on. Every creak of my house, every lash of the rain against the window, sounded like a footstep, like a squeak of porcelain. By the time the gray, miserable morning light filtered through my blinds, I was a wreck. My eyes were bloodshot, and I was vibrating with nervous energy. The logical Elias Thorne was a distant memory, replaced by a man terrified of a child's toy. I spent the morning in my study, the storm continuing to drown the world outside. I knew I couldn't just list the doll for auction. I couldn't in good conscience pass this curse, or whatever the hell it was, onto some unsuspecting collector in Omaha. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I spent hours on old newspaper archives, ancestral databases, and county records. The Blackwood family was easy to track. They were prominent, wealthy, and their downfall was well documented. Abigail's father, Arthur Blackwood, was a harsh man who made his fortune in textiles. Clarissa, Abigail's mother, was his opposite, delicate, prone to nerves, and deeply obsessed with her children. Abigail was their only child to survive infancy. I found several articles about Arthur, praising his business acumen, but it was Clarissa's name that popped up in the strangest places. I found a digitized diary entry from a family friend, dated 1893, a year after Abigail's death. "Visited the estate today. Arthur refuses to see anyone. He is a ghost of a man. But Clarissa, oh, God save her. She spends her days locked in the attic in Abigail's old nursery. The servants whisper that she maintains the effigy as if it were the child itself. They hear her bathing it, singing to it, and this made my blood run cold, reading it the bedtime stories the poor child once loved." Another record from a 1902 asylum intake form confirmed my worst fears. Patient Clarissa Blackwood, admitted by husband Arthur Blackwood. Diagnosis: hysteria, acute grief, severe spiritualist delusion. Patient is physically violent when separated from a large porcelain doll she insists is her living daughter. Patient claims the doll speaks to her, tells her secrets, and this is recorded under significant duress that the doll demands blood as sustenance to maintain its vitality. I sat in my chair, the microfiche reader humming softly. Clarissa hadn't just used the doll as a comfort, she had used it as a vessel. I was dealing with something that had been fed on Clarissa's grief, her madness, and God help me, her blood for nearly a decade. It was 10 p.m. when I finally decided to go back out to the workshop. Barnaby bayed in the house, a terrified, mournful sound as I opened the back door. The storm had worsened. The thunder was now a continuous, rolling vibration that I could feel in my chest. I had a flashlight, my heavy steel crowbar, and a profound sense of doom. I unlocked the workshop door and pushed it open. I was met with a wall of sound. All 4 of my music boxes, antiques I had fully restored and left across various benches, were playing at once. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, Brahms' Lullaby. They were all clashing, playing at different speeds, creating a discordant, horrific cacophony of sound. The workshop was like a frozen tomb. The temperature was easily below freezing. My flashlight beam cut through the air, highlighting the frost forming on my tools. I pointed the beam at the center of the room, at the display case. It was still in chains. The two padlocks were still secured, but I realized something was profoundly wrong when I smelt it. The coppery odor was back, so intense it made my eyes water. It wasn't the smell of old coins. It was the rich, metallic scent of fresh, oxygenated blood. I walked closer, my flashlight beam locked on the chained mahogany cabinet. The chains were tight, the glass was unbroken, the locks were secure. But the doll inside, it had moved. When I had locked it in the chair, it was facing forward, its arms in its lap. Now it was no longer in the chair. It had been twisted around in the narrow confines of the glass and wood case. Its face was now pressed directly against the glass panel. Its mouth was wide open in a silent scream of fury. Its fingers were clawing at the interior of the glass, leaving 5 vertical, coppery red smears of what looked distinctly like dried blood on the internal surface. And in that freezing, discordant silence, one by one, the music boxes all stopped. Except for one. A tiny 19th century French music box tucked in the furthest corner. It was playing a slow, distorted, broken melody of Frère Jacques. And over that broken song, I heard the sound of a woman's voice, Clarissa's voice, singing the words to Abigail, a sound that originated from directly inside the chained mahogany case. The singing did not stop. It wasn't a recording, and it wasn't a trick of the acoustics in the drafty garage. The voice, thin, reedy, and vibrating with an unnatural, maternal desperation, seemed to bypass my ears entirely and echoed directly inside the marrow of my bones. Frère Jacques, dormez-vous? I stood paralyzed, the heavy steel crowbar slipping in my sweaty palms. My flashlight beam remained stubbornly fixed on the display case. The doll's face, pressed flush against the antique glass, looked distorted, monstrous. The 5 bloody streaks trailing down the pane were still wet, reflecting the beam in slick, crimson lines. Every rational fiber of my being, the 20 years of logic and skepticism I had built my life upon, commanded me to smash the glass, to take the crowbar, shatter the case, and beat that porcelain nightmare into 1,000 harmless white shards. But an older, darker instinct, a primal survival mechanism inherited from ancestors who feared the dark, screamed at me to do the exact opposite. If I broke the glass, I broke the barrier. If I shattered that mahogany cage, whatever was trapped inside with the doll, whatever had used Clarissa Blackwood's grief to manifest a voice, would be free. The music box in the corner abruptly snapped with a harsh, metallic twang, the ancient mainspring breaking under impossible tension. The singing stopped instantly, replaced by a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. Then the doll's head slowly, agonizingly scraped against the glass. It rotated, the neck joint emitting a high-pitched, grinding squeal until its milky blue eyes broke contact with my flashlight beam and looked directly toward the workshop door, toward my house. I didn't think, I reacted. I dropped the crowbar, the heavy steel clattering loudly against the concrete, and bolted. I hit the heavy exterior door shoulder first, bursting out into the freezing deluge of the storm. I fumbled frantically with my keys, my hands shaking so violently I dropped them into a mud puddle. Cursing, weeping silently with a terror I had never known, I snatched them up, found the right key, and locked the deadbolt. I didn't care that the locks on the display case were still secure. I needed distance. I sprinted across the flooded yard, the mud sucking at my boots, the rain plastering my shirt to my skin. Lightning arced across the bruised sky, casting strobe light flashes over the property. In one of those flashes, I glanced back at the workshop. The large frosted window near the door was dark, but for a split second I swore I saw a small, child-sized shadow standing just on the other side of the glass, pressing its hands against the pane. I reached the back porch of my house and practically threw myself against the door, twisting the knob and falling into the kitchen. I slammed the door shut, latching the chain and turning the security lock. Barnaby was there instantly. My golden retriever wasn't wagging his tail. He was backed against the kitchen island, the fur on his neck bristling, his lips pulled back in a terrifying, silent snarl, directed entirely at the door I had just locked. "It's out there, buddy," I gasped, sliding down the door until I hit the linoleum floor, pulling my knees to my chest. "It's locked in the shop. It's chained up. It can't get out." I was lying to the dog, and I was lying to myself. I forced myself up. I needed to act. I went from room to room on the ground floor, checking every window lock, pulling down every shade. I dragged a heavy oak dining chair and wedged it under the front doorknob. My house was built in the 1920s, sturdy and thick, but tonight it felt like a house made of paper. I needed a drink. I stumbled to my study, a room lined with books on antiquities, restorations, and history. It was my sanctuary, a place of facts and tangible reality. I went to the small bar cart in the corner, grabbed a heavy crystal tumbler, and poured a generous measure of Kentucky bourbon. My hands were still trembling so badly that the bottle clanked violently against the rim of the glass. I brought the glass to my lips, desperate for the burn of the alcohol to steady my fraying nerves. But as the amber liquid touched my tongue, my stomach violently rebelled. It didn't taste like oak, vanilla, or smoke. It tasted like hot, salty pennies. It tasted exactly like the metallic, coppery stench that had filled the workshop. I spat it out, gagging, and dropped the crystal tumbler. It shattered on the hardwood floor, the bourbon splashing across the rug. I wiped my mouth frantically with the back of my hand, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Patient claims the doll speaks to her, tells her secrets, demands blood as sustenance. The asylum notes from 1902 echoed in my mind. Clarissa Blackwood hadn't just been crazy, she had been a host, a caretaker for a parasite, and now I had brought that parasite into my domain. Suddenly, the lights in the study flickered, once, twice. Then, with a loud electrical pop from the breaker box in the basement, the entire house was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The storm had finally taken down the power lines. "No, no, no," I breathed, fumbling in my wet jacket for my cell phone. I pulled it out. Dead. The battery had been at 40% when I went to the workshop, but now the screen was a lifeless black mirror. The cold, or whatever energy was radiating from that doll, had completely drained it. I was cut off. A low, rumbling growl echoed from the hallway. Barnaby. I grabbed a heavy brass candelabra from the desk, a weapon of last resort, and crept out into the dark hallway. The only illumination came from the sporadic flashes of lightning filtering through the edges of the window blinds. Barnaby was standing at the foot of the stairs, looking toward the front of the house. He wasn't growling at the back door anymore. He was staring at the heavy oak front door, the one I had barricaded with a chair. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding rain. Thud, scrape, squeak. It was faint, muffled by the thick wood and the storm, but it was unmistakable. It was the sound of heavy, unyielding porcelain joints shifting on the wet planks of my front porch. How? My mind screamed. It's chained in a locked mahogany case inside a dead-bolted garage. It doesn't have the physical strength to break out. But then I remembered the stories, the urban legends I had laughed off. Poltergeists, demonic attachments, objects that weren't just haunted, but possessed. The doll was merely an anchor. The entity tied to it wasn't bound by padlocks and chains. Thud. Squeak. The footsteps on the porch moved deliberately, pacing back and forth in front of the door. It sounded like a heavy toddler wearing wooden shoes. Barnaby unleashed a furious volley of barks, launching himself toward the front door, his claws scrabbling on the hardwood. "Barnaby, no! Come here!" I hissed, terrified the dog would somehow compromise the door. Suddenly, the pacing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the footsteps. I crept closer, the brass candelabra raised like a club. I pressed my back against the wall next to the door. I could hear nothing but the rain. Then, the brass doorknob began to turn. It rattled violently, twisting back and forth with a frantic, inhuman strength. The heavy oak door shuddered against the frame. The dining chair wedged beneath the knob groaned under the pressure, the wood beginning to splinter. "Tow away!" I screamed, my voice cracking, sounding like a frightened child. "Leave me alone!" The rattling stopped instantly. A moment later, the old landline phone mounted on the kitchen wall, a vintage rotary dial I kept for aesthetic purposes, began to ring. The sound was jarring, incredibly loud in the dark house. Burring, burring. I stared at it down the hall. Landlines operated on their own power source independent of the grid. It was possible it was the electric company with an automated message. It was possible it was Miller, the liquidator. With shaky steps, I backed away from the front door and moved into the kitchen. Barnaby stayed by the entrance, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. I reached out and picked up the heavy plastic receiver. "Hello?" I whispered. Static. Thick, buzzing static that sounded like rushing water. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked, my voice trembling. Through the static, a sound emerged. It wasn't a voice. It was the sound of something wet and heavy being dragged across a concrete floor. Scrape, thump, scrape, thump. And then, just beneath the static, I heard a child's breathing. It was ragged, congested, and labored, like a child fighting off a severe fever. "Mr. Thorne." The voice was a horrific amalgamation. It was the high-pitched tone of a 7-year-old girl, but layered perfectly underneath it was the ragged, desperate voice of an adult woman. Abigail and Clarissa speaking as one. "It is cold out here, Mr. Thorne. Let us in. We are so very hungry." I slammed the receiver onto the hook, severing the connection. I backed away from the wall, my chest heaving. Crash! The sound of shattering glass erupted from the back of the house, the living room window. Barnaby went ballistic, a frenzy of barking and snarling as he bolted past me toward the living room. "Barnaby, stop!" I yelled, chasing after him. A massive flash of lightning illuminated the living room. The large bay window had been completely smashed in. Rain and wind were pouring through the jagged hole, soaking the carpet and the sofa. But it wasn't the wind that had broken the window. Lying on the floor amidst the shattered glass was a heavy, rusted iron padlock, one of the master locks I had used to chain the display case in the workshop. It had been thrown through the window with enough force to shatter double-paned glass. And standing just outside the broken window, illuminated by the next flash of lightning, was the doll. It was drenched in rain, its black mourning dress clinging to its porcelain body. Its human hair was plastered against its pale, terrifying face. And in its small, articulated hands, it held the heavy steel crowbar I had dropped in the garage. It didn't look like an antique anymore. It looked alive, animated by a vile, ancient malice. Its milky blue eyes were locked directly onto mine. Barnaby lunged at the window, snapping his jaws at the empty air. The doll raised the crowbar, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a stop-motion film playing at the wrong speed. It struck the wooden windowsill, splintering the frame, warning the dog. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I dropped the candelabra, grabbed Barnaby by his collar, and dragged him backward with all my might. We slipped on the wet floor, scrambling frantically toward the staircase. "Upstairs! Go, go, go!" I shouted, shoving the heavy dog up the steps. I reached the top landing and grabbed the heavy wooden door to my master bedroom, pulling Barnaby inside. I slammed the door shut, twisted the lock, and shoved my heavy oak dresser directly in front of it. I collapsed onto the floor, my back against the dresser, wrapping my arms around my terrified dog. Barnaby was shaking uncontrollably, his nose buried in my armpit. I was trapped in my bedroom. No power, No phone, armed with absolutely nothing. Over the howling wind of the storm, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of wet, squeaking porcelain joints climbing up the side of the house. It wasn't taking the stairs. It was scaling the exterior wall, climbing the ivy trellis that led directly up to my second-story bedroom window. Squeak, thud, squeak, thud. It was coming up the wall. It was coming for the glass. And this time, I had nowhere left to run. There is a specific kind of terror that takes hold when reality dissolves. Sitting barricaded in my bedroom, clutching my trembling golden retriever, Barnaby, I listened to the impossible. Over the roaring storm, I heard the distinct, wet squeaking of porcelain joints scaling the thick ivy on the exterior wall. It was climbing up to my second-story window. I pushed Barnaby under the heavy oak bed and grabbed a solid brass floor lamp, gripping the metal pole like a baseball bat. I stared at the dark, rain-lashed glass. A brilliant flash of lightning illuminated the nightmare. Crouched on a narrow ledge, drenched in the storm, was the doll. Its milky blue eyes glowed with a malevolent internal light. Its pale lips were pulled back into a snarl, exposing tiny, sculpted porcelain teeth. In its small, rigid hand, it raised my heavy steel crowbar. Smash! The double-paned glass exploded inward. Freezing rain and wind ripped through the room. A small, pale hand reached through the jagged hole. A thick, coppery black sludge oozed from the doll's joints as it vaulted itself into the room, its limbs popping and snapping with sickening retorts. Before I could swing my weapon, Barnaby lunged from beneath the bed. With a furious bark, he clamped his jaws onto the doll's left arm. There was an awful crack of canine teeth on dense bisque, but the doll didn't even flinch. Unfazed, it casually swung its arm upward, lifting the 80-pound dog off his feet and launching him across the room. Barnaby hit the closet door with a heavy thud and crumpled to the floor, unconscious. "Barnaby!" I roared. Blind rage instantly incinerated my terror. I swung the heavy brass lamp with all my might, connecting squarely with the side of the doll's head. The impact sounded like a gunshot. The doll flew backward, crashing into my nightstand. A massive chunk of its porcelain head sheared off, exposing the dark, hollow cavity inside. But it wasn't empty. Pulsing within the shattered skull was a thick, writhing mass of that black, coppery sludge. It was beating in the darkness like a rotten heart. The doll slowly sat up. Its remaining eye locked onto mine, and the psychic assault began. Voices exploded directly inside my skull. The terrified wail of a 7-year-old child, perfectly blended with the mad, desperate shrieks of a mourning mother. "You stole me! We are the hunger you left behind!" Agonizing visions flashed behind my eyes. Clarissa Blackwood slicing her own palm, feeding the doll her blood in the dark attic. The psychic pressure forced me to my knees as warm blood trickled from my nose. The doll stepped forward and clamped its freezing, rigid hand around my throat. The grip was an iron vice, instantly crushing my windpipe. I was suffocating, pinned to the floor by a statue. Desperate, my sweeping hand brushed against the shattered remains of the window. I closed my fingers around a massive, dagger-like shard of glass. I didn't care as the edges sliced deep into my palm. With a final, breathless thrust, I drove the jagged glass directly into the pulsing black mass inside the doll's broken skull. The reaction was apocalyptic. The doll released me, throwing its head back in a deafening, unnatural shriek of pure spiritual agony. The remaining light bulbs in the room exploded. Foul, sulfurous smoke poured from the wound. I didn't wait. I scrambled to Barnaby, hauling his dead weight over my shoulders. I shoved the heavy dresser aside, ripped the bedroom door open, and sprinted down the pitch-black stairs. I burst out the back door into the driving rain, threw Barnaby into the passenger seat of my truck, and jammed the keys into the ignition. I floored it in reverse, the tires tearing through the wet gravel, and sped out onto the main road. Through the rearview mirror, illuminated by a distant lightning strike, I saw it, standing perfectly still in the center of the shattered second-story window. The doll watched me leave. I had escaped. But as I gripped the steering wheel, staring at the dark road ahead, a grim realization settled over me. The porcelain was just a shell. Blunt force wouldn't kill the parasite, and I couldn't just run while it was anchored in my home. I looked at the fuel gauge. then glanced at the 3 gallons of highly flammable varnish thinner secured in the back of my truck. I took a deep breath, wiping the blood from my nose. I was going to turn this truck around, and I was going to burn my own house to the ground. The rain hammered against the windshield like a barrage of small stones as I slammed my foot on the brakes, throwing the heavy truck into a violent skidding U-turn. The tires hydroplaned for a terrifying, weightless second before gripping the wet asphalt. I couldn't just run away. The realization hit me with the cold clarity of a death sentence. If I abandoned the house, the entity wouldn't simply vanish. It would wait. It would wait for a real estate agent, a curious teenager, or a scavenger. It would spread. I parked at the very edge of my driveway, leaving the engine idling. The headlights cut through the deluge, illuminating the shattered ruins of my front bay window. Barnaby was still breathing softly in the passenger seat, his eyes closed, exhausted from the trauma. I patted his head gently with my uninjured hand, then reached into the back of the cab. I grabbed the 3-gallon jug of highly flammable varnish thinner from my work supplies and retrieved a red magnesium road flare from the emergency kit. The front door of my house was hanging ajar, the thick oak splintered from where the doll had battered its way out. I stepped inside, my heavy boots crunching loudly on the broken glass that littered the foyer. The house was dead quiet, save for the wind howling through the shattered upstairs bedroom window. But the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The oppressive, freezing aura I had felt in the workshop had now infected my entire home. A thin, unnatural layer of white frost coated the hallway walls and the wooden banister, defying the humid, late-October storm raging outside. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and vibrate, thick with unseen malice. I unscrewed the child-proof cap of the varnish thinner with my teeth and began pouring. I slashed the toxic, noxious liquid over the hardwood floors, over the expensive Persian rugs, and up the wooden staircase. The fumes were instantly blinding, burning my eyes and scorching the back of my throat, but I didn't stop. I didn't care about the thousands of dollars of antiques, the rare books, or the memories I was destroying. I only cared about purification. "Clarissa!" I yelled, my voice echoing in the dark, empty hall, sounding raw and completely unhinged. "Abigail, it ends right now!" A wet, heavy thud answered from the top of the stairs. I looked up, wiping the stinging tears from my eyes. The doll stood at the edge of the landing. The black sludge was still oozing steadily from its shattered skull, dripping slowly onto the carpet with a sickening plop. It raised its remaining unbroken arm, pointing a stiff porcelain finger directly at my chest. The dual voices of the mother and child hissed in my mind, no longer a scream, but a venomous, ancient promise that made my vision blur and my knees weak. "You cannot burn what is already dead, Elias. We will peel away your flesh. We will wear your skin next." It leaped. It wasn't a clumsy, rigid jump. It was a terrifying, spider-like pounce. It hurtled down the staircase, its limbs moving with impossible, disjointed speed, its remaining milky eye locked directly on my face. I didn't flinch. I struck the cap off the road flare and dragged the striker against the igniter. Searing, blinding red light illuminated the hallway, accompanied by the violent, sputtering hiss of burning magnesium. Just as the doll was midair, its cold hands reaching for my throat, I tossed the flare directly onto the soaked carpet at the base of the stairs. The ignition was explosive. A solid wall of roaring orange fire erupted between us, feeding instantly and greedily on the varnish thinner. The concussive wave of the sudden blast picked me up and threw me backward, out the front door and onto the wet porch. Inside, the doll hit the flames. The scream that followed was not telepathic. It was audible, physical, and vibrating through the night air, louder than the thunder overhead. It was the sound of 100 tortured souls burning alive at once. Through the roaring, hungry inferno, I watched the porcelain shell crack, blacken, and shatter. The black sludge inside boiled aggressively, evaporating into thick, foul-smelling smoke before the entire figure collapsed into the heart of the fire, consumed by the heat. I dragged my battered body off the porch and limped through the mud to the truck. I threw it into gear and drove to the end of the street, parking at a safe distance. I sat in utter silence, watching as the fire quickly consumed the century-old wood of my home, painting the stormy sky a brilliant, violent orange. Sirens wailed in the distance. The fire department would be far too late to save the structure, but that was exactly what I wanted. Let it burn to the foundation. Let it turn to ash. Barnaby stirred in the passenger seat, letting out a soft whine as he rested his heavy golden chin on my lap. I stroked his fur, my hands stained with soot, rain, and dried blood, watching my life's work turn to cinders. That was 3 years ago. I live in a modern apartment complex now, a sterile box built of concrete, steel, and glass on the 5th floor of a city high-rise. I don't buy antiques anymore. I don't visit estate sales, I don't appraise history, and I absolutely never look in attics. I work in insurance now, dealing with numbers, digital paper, and clean, undeniable facts. But trauma leaves a stain that bleach can't wash out. Sometimes when a bad autumn storm rolls in from the coast and the power flickers in my building, Barnaby will stand up from his dog bed. He won't bark. He will just stare at the heavy metal front door, the fur on his spine bristling as a low growl rumbles in his chest. And in those quiet, pitch-black moments, over the sound of the city rain, I can still smell the faint, coppery scent of old blood in the air. And I find myself lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if fire is ever really enough to kill a ghost, or if it only burns away the cage, setting the monster completely free.